Thank you very much. And at the outset, let me thank you for inviting me, also to make it possible for me to join your conference without using all those carbon-emitting air miles that so often we have to do in order to join together and talk about these issues. And I'm particularly honored to be sharing a platform with my good friends Chris Westall and Doug Roach. And I'm looking forward to interacting with you both. So I've been challenged to talk about arousing and sustaining political will. And the first thing is, what is political will? And it's the summoning the vision, the determination, and the tools to influence and achieve certain objectives and outcomes. Now, civil society has many elements. Many people hear about the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, but civil society is so much more and broader than just this. There are elite expert actors. There are the non-governmental organizations and institutes working on specific issues. Participatory NGOs geared towards mobilizing public opinion, public interest and action, but grassroots activists also, including the practitioners of nonviolent direct action, that want to highlight specific sites or abuses and directly engage in halting or slowing military activities, or in some cases in presenting and demonstrating the more earth-sustaining, human security-sustaining alternatives. And our means are also very many. Raising awareness of the problems and the need to deal with them in certain ways, identifying options for change, promoting key objectives for change, in a sense, setting out the priorities and putting them on the table for dealing with the problems, the knowledge and the expertise, the mobilizing of public and political opinion, which inevitably interact with each other and have influence on each other, the mainstreaming of issues and then the lobbying for particular solutions, and then also, and it's often forgotten, helping to implement and provide tools for implementing progressive steps, and so on. Now, none of these actors or means are mutually exclusive, and many, I argue, are mutually enhancing and reinforcing, even if they are not directly tied together by means of joint strategies and coalitions. So what we need, if you like, are expert activists and active experts. Well, now, as you said, we have presidents like President Obama and prime ministers across the world who are expressing their support for the vision of a world free of nuclear weapons. But it's time to work out in earnest how to turn that vision into reality. And I'm skeptical when I hear some of them speak and they talk about putting it off to a very long timeline, whether they are really focusing on implementing that vision and turning it into reality, not in some long distant future, but in our lifetimes. And I'm older than President Obama, and I intend to see a world free of nuclear weapons in my lifetime. This is possible, practical, and most of us here will argue and will agree is necessary and urgent. Well, civil society, we're frequently credited with the idealistic thinking that identifies the visions of how we'd like the world to be. And we'd like a world that is working to reduce poverty and to build peace, security, and justice. For example, in a world without nuclear weapons, because we cannot find those things, we cannot build those things in a world that still has nuclear weapons. But if we look at recent history, civil society has played a very significant part in bringing disarmament objectives to government and political and public attention on issues ranging from anti-personal landmines to banning nuclear testing. And that was actually the unfinished business of the title of my book, and the subject was how civil society working with governments brought about an end to nuclear testing. And this partnership between governments and civil society actors brought about the 1997 Mine Ban Treaty and the 2008 Cluster Munitions Convention. And less formally, and utilizing a considerable tactical toolbox, NGOs and civil societies kept alive the hope of a CTBT and then worked closely with many diplomats and officials to create the conditions to bring that treaty to conclusion. And let's not forget the work of women's and human rights organizations, including WILPF and Amnesty and others, as the driving force behind the adoption in October of 2000 of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. Civil society has long engaged very actively on the issues of the disarmament and non-proliferation of nuclear, chemical and biological weapons and this is very related, I think, to control and eliminate the guns, small arms and light weapons. We've had some successes, some setbacks and disappointments. We've learned many lessons, but we have to remain committed, focused and active. We have to resist pessimism, but temper our optimism with critical awareness of past letdowns, so as to be ready to move our governments beyond their timidity and beyond their being held hostage by the powerful but narrow interests of nuclear and military establishments that continue to manufacture and profit from the tools and technologies that bring us only greater insecurity. So as indicated in my opening remarks, there are many kinds of civil society engagements. And far from being distinct and separate, effective civil society strategies have to employ all of these approaches, separately or combined, depending on the particular circumstances. All of these have different but mutually reinforcing parts to play in arousing and sustaining political will for the abolition of nuclear weapons. Now, President Obama may, or he may not, be the transformational leader that many hope, but he will not be able to make progress on the abolition of nuclear weapons without massive support and pressure from civil society in the United States and all around the world. Other major challenges clamour for his attention, dealing with America's economic, health and military-industrial problems, not to mention climate change and the legacy of the Bush administration's wrong-headed wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So for the United States to make real progress on disarmament, we have to show that this is a vital and important priority in our security agenda, and that reducing and eliminating nuclear weapons will help Obama achieve his other perspectives. Now, at the moment, Obama's administration is focused on 4 nuclear-related objectives, all of which are part of a long-standing arms control and non-proliferation agenda. Ratifying the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, concluding a bilateral follow-on to start with the Russians, and then getting that ratified by the Senate, and we hope a follow-on to that follow-on with even deeper cuts. Thirdly, making the 2010 NPT review conference at least appear successful enough to send strong signals that the non-proliferation regime is healthy enough to convince potential proliferators and domestic skeptics. And fourthly, to get the CD to work on a fissile material treaty. Now, it's important that civil society, US and international, engage constructively in supporting these objectives. But we must also make it clear that real progress towards peace and security in a world free of nuclear weapons, as President Obama told us he wanted in Prague and again at the Security Council, will require bolder, deeper measures and changes. So I want to focus specifically, in fact, on 3 very practical and realizable disarmament objectives that have the power to create political momentum and to move people in the streets. They are simple and they make obvious and inspirational sense. 1 is to get one nuclear weapon state to renounce its dependency on nuclear weapons. And I still think we can win this in the UK, where replacement of Trident is by no means a done deal. You know, when you have all 3 parties talking about, worrying about the cost of this, then you know that none of them are convinced by the security arguments. If just one nuclear power decides that it isn't worth renewing its nuclear weapons, that would do more for the nuclear disarmament, and also, in fact, for the nuclear non-proliferation regime, than even the reduction of several thousand nuclear weapons from the bloated US and Russian arsenals. It would be transformative because in committing to cross the threshold from nuclear possessor to non-possessor, a nuclear weapon state in full compliance with the NPT, if you like, the UK would thus come clean in admitting and exposing the expensive irrelevance of nuclear weapons for our genuine security. These are inhumane systems of mass destruction. They cannot bring us security, but we in the UK cannot do this on our own. We need your help, active and political, to put pressure on our government to see sense, and to put pressure on your governments to help our government see sense and do the right thing. And even writing letters to the UK ambassador in your countries will help. And please also send those letters, of course, to Gordon Brown in number 10 Downing Street, but send it to the ambassadors, because then it has to go through the Foreign Office. Use your own words, but call on the UK to demonstrate its support for, and of course to give a chance to the success of, President Obama and Gordon Brown's call for nuclear weapon-free world, and to make good their commitment to become a disarmament laboratory, which means using the UK atomic weapons establishments at Aldermaston and Burfield, not for building the next generation of nuclear weapons, but for learning and teaching about safer, more secure means of dismantlement, disposal, verification and implementing disarmament. Now the second, which is likely to be a transitional step while laying the groundwork for a comprehensive nuclear weapon convention, is to bring forward the recognition in law of the widely accepted fact and moral understanding that any use of nuclear weapons would be a crime against humanity. As nuclear arsenals are reduced, the real tipping point will come when the nuclear weapon states understand and demonstrate that there is no role for nuclear weapons in their doctrines and policies. So we have to stop tinkering around the edges of nuclear doctrines and openly and unequivocally state, and this has to be done by the NATO states, but it also has to be done by non-nuclear weapon states, that there are no circumstances in which the use of nuclear weapons would be acceptable, moral, or consistent with international and humanitarian law. And there are no circumstances in which we, as citizens of our countries, some of which, like Canada, are part of nuclear alliances, would accept nuclear weapons being used on our behalf. Not for retaliation, not for second strike, certainly not for first use. And then thirdly, and this is what I want to spend the last few minutes concentrating on, to get the process started toward a nuclear weapon convention that will comprehensively reduce nuclear dangers and provide the framework and target dates for the total abolition and elimination of nuclear weapons. Now, we've done the initial work on demonstrating the feasibility by means of the NGO-drafted Model Nuclear Weapon Convention. But while this continues to be useful as a resource, our campaigning strategy now has to move well beyond this, as we now need to get to the concept. We now need to get the concept of a nuclear weapon convention into the political mainstream. There are a number of ways to get us from the vision and the obvious logic of a comprehensive prohibition treaty that people in the streets understand, to governments advocating putting a nuclear weapon convention onto the negotiating table. Now, I'm working with ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, on an exciting strategy that we're going to be launching soon. And we hope will engage many other NGOs and networks. Our objective is to build momentum for the abolition of nuclear weapons. In other words, we want a nuclear weapon convention by 2020. The current focus for many governments and NGOs is the 2010 review conference of the NPT, scheduled for May next year. So we have a strategy that recognizes the importance of the NPT RevCon politically, but goes beyond it. In addition to supporting NGO actions in New York, we want to encourage civil society groups all over the world to lobby and act locally with international coordination and impact from now, so both before, during and after the review conference. And it's especially important to ensure that NGOs are strongly positioned to keep building for nuclear abolition regardless so that we don't become hostage to the NPT's outcome, whether that is good or bad. Our strategy comprises two phases. The first important task is to get the goal of a nuclear weapon convention onto the agenda as a realistic and reasonable concept, even among those who may disagree with the details or even its aims. We've won the moral and security arguments for why nuclear weapons should be abolished, but we need to shift the debate from why to when and how. So the strategy engages with the NPT, but does not let NGO resources and energy become swamped by the NPT agenda. And many NGOs we know are planning things in New York. We support these efforts, but want to do something that complements them. So the aim of the first phase, which will be from now to the May 2010 review conference, is to get governments to identify the need for some kind of nuclear weapons prohibition treaty into their statements and working papers. Whether or not they refer to an NWC by name doesn't matter, as many non-aligned countries and Australia and Austria have done. We want consideration of such a treaty to be mentioned in the statements. So our supporters must try to get some kind of language into their own country statements and working papers, but also to move beyond their own countries to get them into statements so that we're covering the whole world. The non-aligned countries, countries with more marginal resources on these issues, we have to reach out to those countries. And for those governments that don't feel comfortable with explicit reference to the Nuclear Weapon Convention per se, NGOs could suggest that the government endorse the UN Secretary General's 5-point disarmament plan as put forward on the 24th of October last year, 2008, which of course includes consideration of a legal framework or nuclear weapon convention. And there's other ways to do that. We could talk about that in more detail. Now, the second phase, from the end of the 2010 conference to 2015 and beyond, starts with a weekend of internationally coordinated, locally implemented actions after the end of the review conference. The intention being to inspire and to keep up the momentum for nuclear abolition, with messages tailored to build on or parachute over the NPT outcome, whether it's deemed a success or a failure. And the aim of this second phase is to build civil society government partnerships to get the conditions and steps for a nuclear weapon convention on track. Now, this part of our action begins with internationally coordinated, locally implemented series of actions all over the world. If you're in a nuclear weapon country, you do it, for example, at the UK, Aldermaston and Faslane, you do it at a nuclear weapon complex. That would be, if you're not a nuclear weapon country, if you've got uranium mining, you do it somewhere that's related to that, or you do it at your seat of government, or your foreign ministry, or you choose the embassy of one of the key nuclear weapon states, or even all of them. It doesn't need large numbers, but it needs a lot of different kinds of actions that focus on all the different elements of the nuclear weapon chain. And you can choose your time, because we're on different time zones, over that 2 days of June the 5th and 6th. Each national or local group or network will organize your own kind of demo or action. And though the actions and the locations are localized, the message will be coordinated internationally by a group of us working with ICANN. We'll evaluate the end of the outcome of the review conference, and we'll choose and we'll pick up a message, and then we'll spread that around by means of a website. We can again talk about those kinds of details. The inspiring unified message will be about the need for a nuclear weapon convention, and will play an important role in how our movement is able to move forward after the 2010 review conference. So whether that is viewed as a success, able to adopt decisions to move forward, or a failure in which there, God forbid, is deadlock and no agreement, we need to be ready with a strong and positive message that inspires and encourages that now is the time to push for a nuclear weapon treaty. So to conclude, I am not saying that these are the only campaigns to pursue. Many elements in the 13 steps and on the current to-do list are still very important and valid, But these are already on the agenda. They're on President Obama's agenda. They're on the agenda of many of our governments. And many governments will be pushing for these objectives, principles and steps. It is for civil society to be at least a step ahead, thinking about the messages and strategies of what needs to be the priority agenda looking to the future. We have to get that message to the street, and it has to be simple and inspiring in order to build civil society movements to create the conditions for nuclear abolition. What is useful for some national and international NGOs with particular kinds of expertise and access to engage with the day-to-day minutiae of the NPT and arms control agenda, and to ensure the civil society around the world is kept informed of the developments and outcomes of what is happening in the US-Russia talks, with the CTBT, with the FISBAN in Geneva, with the NPT in New York. Others need to be doing far more to make the demand for the abolition of nuclear weapons a high priority for people around the world, in our streets, in our pubs, in the factories, in the fields, in government, and in the buses and trains, and to shake our government's complacency and business as usual timidities. When the NPT states parties converge in May, the die will largely be cast. No doubt it will be helpful for civil society to be visible, and for a representative cross-section of youth, mayors for peace, parliamentarians, etc., to be part of that. That's great. But if we really want to influence the outcome of the review conference, we have to be working now, not only to get our objectives onto the agenda, but to show the way towards the steps, to implement the steps, and to build the will for the nuclear abolition and nuclear weapon convention. That, more than anything else, will reinforce and fulfill the security objectives and obligations of the NPT and the non-proliferation regime. So I hope that's given a few ideas to people, and now I'd be kind of interested to hear your comments and questions.
Now we're talking. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you. Now I would like to turn to our two panelists here in Toronto, the two ambassadors, and ask them to offer their remarks or questions to them.
Thank you, Sergey. I thought that was terrific, Rebecca. Thank you. And I'm going to have time later to speak, so beyond one brief comment, I'll leave this time for others. But I find the notion that Trident replacement wouldn't be financed, and that the UK might in fact renounce its nuclear weapons state status. Interesting indeed. You know much more about UK politics than I do. I don't know if that's possible, but it doesn't take much thought, I don't think, to imagine that the UK's international standing and prestige and influence would be a whole lot better served by that step than it is by the UK's current nuclear deterrent. That a fascinating notion. Thank you. But I won't take more time now. I'll take it later and let you comment on that, or turn to Doug.
Doug? Thanks, Rebecca. Doug Roach here. Rebecca, you showed again the tremendous leadership that you are giving in both your analysis of substance and your planning for strategy. Rebecca, you're getting better all the time.
Yeah.
I want to
Thank you very much.
I want to endorse, Rebecca, what you said, that Obama needs massive public support. There's a famous story told about Franklin Roosevelt in his early days of his presidency, when he received a delegation of people pressing him to adopt a policy, and Roosevelt turned to them and said, well, I'm convinced, I want to do it, now you go out there and press me to do it publicly. This is exactly the situation Obama's facing now. He needs tremendous public pressure in his own country and from like-minded countries. And certainly we here in Canada, I think, have a real responsibility to come in behind, in a vigorous manner, come in behind the Obama aim for a nuclear weapons-free world. Now, one point, Rebecca, I just want to raise here in this moment, and that's the question of the nuclear doctrine. Everything that you have pointed to would take us forward, and we're coming up and we're crashing against that final wall of resistance, namely those particularly within the Washington establishment who are saying that we have to have extended deterrence because our allies and all the people we're protecting in the NATO umbrella are depending on us, and moreover, other states will go and get nuclear weapons if we don't have them. And so they're continuing to perpetuate this phony argument that deterrence is our lifeline. How do you think, Rebecca, we can break down that argument finally about the doctrine of nuclear weapons?
Thank you. Do you want me to respond to those two first,
yes, sure,
or should I take more
please.
from?
No,
Okay.
that's it for now. Yeah, please respond.
Yeah, okay. It's great to hear both of your voices here. I really do believe that we can win this in the UK. Gordon Brown is almost there, but he thinks that he can cut a few more of the nuclear warheads. He can reduce the warheads a little bit more. Then at the Security Council, he announced we'd go from 4 submarines to 3 submarines. And then he looks around and says, how come this isn't having an effect on non-proliferation, on the future proliferators? And it's like a smoker who says, oh, I'll cut down from 80 to 60. But it's the transformative step of saying we don't need them for our security that makes the key difference in terms of nuclear security and actually of nuclear non-proliferation. And this is where, Doug, you're absolutely right. Doctrine is key. Now, just 3 weeks ago, I was in Japan. I was invited by some Japanese NGOs. I met with some of the people from the new Japanese government, the Democratic Party of Japan. You know, the foreign minister, Okada-san, is very keen to get a debate going with the US precisely on this issue of doctrine. Now, of course, I've made an argument for the use altogether of nuclear weapons to be declared and recognized as a crime against humanity, because I think that that's the real step that will shift us transformationally towards being ready for a nuclear weapon convention. But I do recognize that in this period of time when NATO is looking at it's supposed to be developing the next strategic concept, if we could push them to go to, at the very, very least, the so-called core deterrence, the sole purpose deterrence, that the only role for nuclear weapons is to deter a nuclear weapon attack, that would at least be a step forward for NATO. Try to tip them even further to no first use. And one of my concerns are actually that I'm worried that the Australia-Japanese Commission is going to suggest no first use by the year 2025. We want the convention by that year. No first use ought to begin to be put into place now. But we have to, in arguing for this, recognize that that's like the smoker needing some nicotine of some kind, whether Nicorette or something, to deal with the addiction. But the problem with no first use ultimately is it still allows for a use of nuclear weapons in retaliation as valid, and it puts that forward as if it were legal. Whereas if you really look in detail at what the International Court of Justice identified, that kind of retaliation when deterrence has failed would in fact be illegal. So I think we have to come up, we have to be able to argue with them that we are not saying that deterrence has no role in the alliances and in the world as it is today, but that nuclear weapons have no legitimate and actually no sensible or effective role as a tool of deterrence. Because if those fail, then you end up with nuclear weapon use and indeed potentially nuclear war. So you have to use non-nuclear means of deterrence, as many as possible non-military. But I think in the transition, we also have to reassure them of the possibility. Now, when I was in Japan, we had the Japanese government wanting to engage in a discussion that said that they wanted US policy to change to no first use. We were still hearing that Americans, especially Republicans, but also people working on things like the US Nuclear Posture Review, and senators, both Democrat and Republicans in the US, were telling Obama and telling the administration that Japan would go nuclear. This is nonsense. I spent a lot of time talking with a whole different range of people in Japan, and there's no question Japan wouldn't go nuclear. Maybe having the extended deterrence during the Cold War was a mechanism by which to entice countries like Japan and Germany to join the Non-Proliferation Treaty as non-nuclear weapon states in the 1960s. But we're not in the 1960s now. We're in the 21st century. So we have to absolutely narrow down the role, and here NATO has to give the lead. We absolutely have to give the lead, and every single country in NATO needs to be arguing that the US nuclear posture review should adopt, at the very least, this core deterrence posture, and that this should be reflected in the NATO strategic concept. It's a no-brainer, I think, at this point. And then, as we're doing that, we, of course, should be arguing that we would, of course, want them to go further.